Okay, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second topical training webinar, Strategies for Success, Effective Planning for Program Sustainability, excuse me. This is our day one of a 2-day training on sustainability, and we have 90 minutes with you today. So I'm going to hand it to Labrita White to share opening remarks on behalf of FYSB. Labrita?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Taya. Welcome, as Taya stated, to our second personal responsibility education topical training for fiscal year 2021. And this fiscal year is just about coming to a close. So again, I'm Labrita White, one of the program managers for the Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program. And again, I want to thank you for committing to this 2-day topical training session on sustainability. And it's most appropriate during this time as many of our PREP grants are coming to a close at the end of this fiscal year. So now, as many of you are probably aware, we typically host these trainings in person, which I think we all can agree would be our first preference. Not just for the opportunity to travel and see one another, peers and colleagues, but also to take advantage of face-to-face interactions of real life learning. Those components of our topical trainings when we're able to meet in person that include Q&A, discussions, and those opportunities to network. But as you all have done with your programming over the last 18 months or more, we adapt, you adapt, we adapt, and our youth have had to adapt. With what APP knows will be yet another successful and informative virtual topical training session, adaptation is definitely the word for today. Again, speaking of adapting, it's fairly apparent that there has been much change around the country and the world over this last year. Change that has certainly impacted the youth that you serve, some more than others, as well as their worldview, how they view the world and their place in it. And I don't want to discount that the impact has just been for youth, but it also has been for many of you who work day to day with young people, and then some of the impact that change has had on even your personal lives. And so we don't discount that, and we definitely pat you on the back for continuing your efforts of putting youth first. Perhaps it's not just their perspective of the world, but their perspectives have changed and are changing as to how they interact with one another, how they interact with you, and how they utilize the important information and skills that they're developing through the PREP programming. So all of that reinforces for me, and I would hope for you as well, that a critical part of our jobs is to ensure that programming evolves. Again, adapting to the needs of young people we interact with, or you're interacting with, and we do too as well, but you're interacting with those young people that are program participants day in and day out, to be sure that your work meets them where they are and helps them to see their futures in a positive way, full of opportunity. And again, that requires change, adaptation. So it also explains why we gather a few times a year for these topical training events, to make certain grantees are ready for the challenges they face as PREP program providers and the evolving challenges our participants face in their lives. In the past, we've usually held these trainings over consecutive days. So this session is a bit more brief. It's going to be held today, this afternoon, and then part 2 will take place on Thursday. So that's a little different for us. But nonetheless, some great information, strategies, and tips are going to be shared. And again, this will be an opportunity for you to absorb the information on the first day, all of the materials and information that's shared, hopefully more thoroughly, and then jump right back in with us in preparation for day 2. So this week's training for today, Tuesday and Thursday, will focus on strategies for success, effective planning for program sustainability. And with the recently completed grant application and review process, and as you know, your project's grant funding for some of you may be expiring, you'll recognize sustainability as an important part of our collective efforts. The prevention, education, and other support services that you provide to youth across the nation, among tribes and the U.S. territories, it's even more critical. As youth and families, as I've already stated, it's a different time, a time for adaptation, but families, and even some of you and some of us may have faced some tremendous loss due to the pandemic, natural disasters, the significance of gun violence, and the list goes on, even to the point of our overindulgence in virtual communication. And so that brings me to another area where young people have had to adapt and change, and so have your programs, is the social distancing that has come about. It brings a unique spin on how we interact and engage with one another and with youth in the programs that you serve. It also creates new opportunities. So it's not all gloom and doom. So for your programs to expand and to reach and to look for ways to meet youth where they are and fostering opportunities so that they can realize their dreams and their visions. And so with those obstacles that provide the opportunities for reimagining the work, how appropriate for this training to be titled Reimagining Sustainability Planning. And this training will be presented by the Center for Implementation, or TCI. And their mission is to accelerate the application of implementation science to improve outcomes for the youth that you are serving and youth and programs that are serving constituents throughout. And so what they provide today will be definitely a valuable resource. TCI has trained over 4,000 participants through their training efforts. And I'm having a computer issue, so give me 1 second. Thank you. So TCI has trained over 4,000 professionals, and they've been involved in over 100 change projects in 10 plus countries. That's simply amazing. So the workshops presented by Dr. Sylvia Khan and Dr. Julia Moore will cover facets of sustainability and implementation, partnerships, and relationship building. We really hope you're ready to be an active participant in the workshop activities and encourage you to challenge yourselves and identify opportunities to put these concepts that they'll be sharing into action. Now, I'd like to extend my thanks and gratitude to all of the grantees. You've worked really hard over the past. For some of you, it's been 5 years, some in excess of almost 10 years with some of our state grant programs, and others almost 4 years. So I just want to thank you and express our gratitude for the hard work that you've put into implementing PREP projects. And just to know, it takes a lot of compassion and caring, not to mention time and effort, to positively impact young people's lives. Your dedication is extraordinary. It's greatly valued among families you impact, and certainly at the APP program here in DC. I also want to thank our PREP training and technical assistance partner, RTI International, for their continued partnership, expertise, and effort that they've contributed to help us prepare you for and host this event. Not only this event, but many of the training and technical assistance opportunities that have been hosted over the past year. A lot of our planning had to also be adapted to support the virtual programming, our virtual interactions. And I think they've done a phenomenal job of hosting even those think tank type sessions with grantees where you could share ideas and glean ideas from others as you've had to pivot. So just one last request for you. At the end of the workshop on Thursday, we'll be providing a link to an evaluation survey. Please, please, please be sure to complete the evaluation. Of course, that's an instrumental tool in helping us advance and improve the APP program for our grantees and for the APP program at large. And so once again, I just want to thank you for your support and the support that you've provided to youth and your communities, for representing the Family and Youth Services Bureau Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program so well over the last several years. And hopefully we'll be continuing to work with many of you. I know we just had a grant opportunity We can't share any information about the outcome of that at this time, but our hope is that many of you will continue to be engaged in this great and important work of supporting young people to make positive choices and decisions. So at this time, I'll pass the mic to Taya McMillan with RTI, and she's going to share some housekeeping as well as some instructions that will help you to navigate the training on today and Thursday. Taya?
Okay, thanks so much, Librita. As she mentioned, I'm going to share a few housekeeping items before I welcome our speakers. First, you should see a link to a workbook in the chat box, and we're going to be using the workbook throughout the training, so please take a moment to download that. And if anyone doesn't see it, let us know. We'll make sure we get you that link. And then, as Cameron mentioned, if you have any questions or technical issues during the training, please drop them in the chat box and we'll make sure those get taken care of. Now I'd like to introduce Sobia Khan and Dr. Julia Moore with the Center for Implementation, or TCI. As Librita mentioned, they are experts in making complex concepts like implementation science and sustainability easy to understand and actionable. So without further ado, let's welcome Sobia Khan and Dr. Julia Moore.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. And we are so excited to have you here to talk about sustainability. I'm going to hand it to Sobia to quickly introduce us, although we've had lots of introductions. So Sobia.
So thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. We are the Center for Implementation, as has been mentioned a few times already. So we are located in Toronto, Canada. Don't hold that against us. We work internationally with many people across the world and a lot of people in the US. And so what we have done over the past few years, Julia and I like to joke that we're rogue scientists. We're trained in implementation science and research. We worked for years together doing research, and then decided that there was this area that really needed to have some support, which is trying to make the science of implementation practical and accessible. So thinking about people who work in organizations and communities who need to know the science of implementation, but also need it to be really grounded and pragmatic. And so that's what we started doing exclusively, and that's why we started the Center for Implementation. So we train many, many people across the world. So we have online courses and tailored workshops just like this. And we also provide implementation support in different ways for different kinds of projects. So I'm going to hand it off to Julia now.
So as Taya mentioned, there is a workbook for both days. Highly, highly, highly recommend you go and download that. There's a link in the chat box. There are lots of the visuals and resources and definitions, and all the activities are in there as well. So this is a two-part workshop. Today, we're going to talk about the key components of sustainability, roles in the implementation system, and understanding and prioritizing levers for change. On Thursday, we're going to get into characteristics of collaborative partnerships, trust building, and selecting purposeful partnering strategies. A small little note, I know that lots of people are on Zoom a long time, but we just want to say that we really love people who stay on video, even if you come on and off, because it helps us feel like we are not speaking into a void. So thank you, thank you, thank you to all the people who actually come on video. We truly appreciate it. Today's objectives are really about distinguishing the key components of sustainability, which is kind of the foundational piece to help you plan for sustainability. Then we're going to talk about how you can identify and link the different roles in the implementation system to a framework that is going to be used to help you think about who you can partner with when you plan for sustainability. Then we'll talk about different levers for change and how you can prioritize levers in order to plan for sustainability. To make sure that this is really interactive, we have embedded 4 activities in today's agenda. So with that, I'm literally going to start with our very first activity right now. And all of our activities are using the annotation tool. So activity number 1 is to get to know a little bit more about you. In order to do this, we want you to pull out the annotation tool. So perfect. Taya just put the instructions in the chat box. But essentially the instructions say, at the top of your screen, it should say, you are viewing Julia Moore's screen. Beside that should be a little box that says view options. And when you hover over it, annotate will show up. When you click on the annotate box, all of a sudden you're going to get a bar that shows up on your screen. I recommend picking a stamp. So there's like an arrow or a heart or a star. So I recommend picking a stamp, and literally this screen is here. So try stamping on this screen right now. Perfect. Oh, thank you. Amazing. Okay. So if anyone is having problems, type into the chat box that you're having problems and let us know. Side note, if you're on your phone, it does not work very well. But if you want to, for us to add a stamp for you, you can type it into the chat box and we can add a stamp for you. Amazing. Okay. So lots and lots of stamps. You can pick any stamp you want. And I'm going to now clear all your stamps. And the first question we have, that was my stamp. The first question we have for you is, where are you? Where are you physically located right now?
And Dr. Diana Clemens has written in the chat that they're from Arlington, Texas. Lisa's from Kentucky, Lauren's from South Carolina. So some people are also writing the chat. And oh, Virgin Islands is not shown, which is an oversight, but there's Virgin Islands, Oregon, Alabama, Puerto Rico, from everywhere, all over the country. Baltimore, Arlington, Little Rock. That's awesome.
And if your place is not written, you can select the text feature and you could write it right onto the screen on top of everyone's stamps. Amazing. So really, really, really great diversity in where people are showing up from right now. So I'm going to clear that drawing. And my next question is, thinking about these 5 roles, which I know are limiting, what do you think best describes your role? Are you a facilitator? Are you an administrator? Are you an intermediary or a funder? Are you a researcher or evaluator? Are you a grantee? And you can click on more than one of them. And again, if you feel like your piece is not there, you can select the text box and just add it to the screen. It'll be totally anonymous and you can show up on the screen as well.
I'm not seeing the text box.
Oh, you're not seeing the text box. So the text box should be on your bar. See where it says stamp. 2 to the left, it should say the word text. And maybe Sylvia, can you text right on the screen to show what it looks like if you do that? And it would look like. Perfect. Excellent.
If your role is not listed, you could always use the text function and write on the screen what your role is, or you could just type in the chat what your role is.
All right. So with that, we all know how to use the annotation function, which we're going to use over and over and over again today. But I am going to get us started talking about the first topic, which has to do with what are the key components of sustainability. So the first thing is, I think it's really important to remember why it is so important to talk about sustainability. That's because if we are not successfully sustaining the programs that we start implementing, in some ways, it means that we end up wasting a lot of time, resources, and money putting programs into place and then not sustaining them and needing to start over and over and over again. And so we have this huge opportunity when we can plan for sustainability so that we can continue to actually deliver those programs and actually produce the outcomes that you have been working so hard to achieve. But talking about sustainability planning can sometimes be a little bit daunting and overwhelming. And if you have ever been part of sustainability planning, you might know that sometimes there are tense moments in that process. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that happens. The very first part is making sure that we really understand what it is we're talking about when we're talking about sustainability. So the first piece of that is really disentangling. Are you talking about sustaining the what or the program you're implementing? Or are you talking about sustaining what we call the how or the change strategies you're using to change people's behavior? So say you're working in schools and you have teachers delivering a program in schools. The program the teachers are delivering is the what. That's the program they're delivering in that school. So you can ask a question, are you talking about continuing to have teachers deliver that program in schools? And or are you talking about the way that you are training and supporting teachers to deliver that program? So one of the very first things that often gets confusing when we talk about sustainability is some people are sometimes talking about, oh, let's make sure teachers continue to deliver this program. And other people are talking about, let's make sure we continue to train new teachers and provide support to teachers as they continue to deliver it. So this is sort of one of the first pieces that is key to understanding sustainability, is disentangling the program and the strategies you're using to support people to actually deliver that program. The next piece that's really important to know and understand is that our understanding from the research about what sustainability is has changed a lot in the past 10 to 15 years. There used to be a belief that sustainability meant doing the exact same thing over and over and over and over. But we now know that sustainability is dynamic. And I feel like the opening remarks were so helpful in setting this up, because it's all about being able to make adaptations. And that is really key to understanding how we can effectively sustain, is realizing that sustainability is dynamic and requires us to make adaptations. And when we know that, it sets us up to better plan for sustainability as we go in. So when we talk about sustainability, there's really 5 key components to sustainability. Here are the 5 key components. And a heads up, in about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, we're going to do an activity where we map some examples to these specific components. And you can also find these in the workbook. So when we're talking about sustaining things, we can be talking about sustaining the what, that's your program or your practice that you are doing. We can be talking about, are you sustaining the how, the change strategies you're using to support people to actually deliver that program. You can think about, are you sustaining how you're keeping track of outcomes? So are you continuing to collect data? Do you know what that looks like? And we can think about, are we making adaptations to the what, to the how, or to the way that we track outcomes? Because we know that those things are often going to change over time. So we can think about, what are the kinds of adaptations we're making to each of those different components. The 5th component of sustainability is about talking about the different factors that affect sustainability. So there's all of these things out there that increase or decrease the likelihood we're going to be able to sustain something. And these are those factors that really impact our ability to plan for sustainability and then ultimately sustain things. And so one of the things that often happens is, when we start planning for sustainability, it can honestly feel overwhelming because there's so many different pieces. But when we disentangle them, it kind of sets us up to say, hey, I can walk through step by step each of these components with our team to better plan for sustainability. A little note about factors that affect sustainability. is there's lots of different frameworks and tools out there that can help you think about different factors that affect sustainability. The two most commonly used ones kind of around the world are the NHS Sustainability Tool and the Program Sustainability Assessment Tool, or PSAT. And the PSAT showed up in some previous training materials you have received. And so we are going to deep dive into talking about the PSAT a little bit later today. But there's lots and lots of resources in these that can help you think about these different factors. The last thing I think that's kind of helpful to know when you think about planning for sustainability is that sometimes conversations about sustainability can feel a little bit like this. So I remember the very first time I was sitting in a meeting, we were working with a community. I was living in Pennsylvania. We were trying to sustain, in fact, a parenting program in Pennsylvania. And it felt like everyone at the table was talking about something different. And that's because, in fact, a lot of times we are, because we haven't teased apart these different components. And so what we are going to do right now is we're going to walk through kind of an imaginary scenario that's really based on some real examples that we have seen, and get you to think about which of these components of sustainability are they really talking about. So first, I'm going to walk you through kind of imagine there's 6 people, and this is what the 6 people say. And then we're going to go step by step through each of these statements and think about what aspect of sustainability are they talking about. So imagine that the first person says, if we want to plan for sustainability, we need a plan to train new staff and facilitators. The second person says, based on what's happening, we know that we need to adapt some of our strategies to support staff and facilitators to implement the program. A third person says, I know all these ideas are important, but let's focus on the goal, preventing teen pregnancy. Fourth person said, all of those come later. We need to talk about funding. If we don't have money, we don't have a program. Fifth person says, we have a huge fidelity issue where staff aren't even implementing the program properly. We should start there. And finally, someone says, what about starting with things we know matter, like having strong partners? So I don't know if this kind of conversation resonates with any of you, but we've seen a lot of conversations planning for sustainability that look a lot like this. So thinking about the first statement, if we want to plan for sustainability, we need a plan to train new staff and facilitators. I want you to pull out your annotation tool again, pull out the little stamp and say, is this an example of the what, the program that people are implementing? Is this the how, the strategies we're using to support people to deliver this program? The outcomes, adaptations, or the factors? Fabulous. So exactly. So this is an example of talking about sustaining the how, the strategies we use to change people's behavior. Okay, next statement. So second person says, based on what's been happening, we know that we need to adapt some of our strategies to support staff and facilitators to implement the program. What are they talking about? And I'll give you a bit of a hint. This one can kind of fall into 2 different categories. And remember, you don't just have to limit to the what, the how, the outcomes. You can also include the factors or adaptations at the top and the bottom. Awesome. So now we're having a little bit more diversity in what people are saying. So this is kind of an example right here of where we're talking about making adaptations, right? They're saying we need to adapt some of our strategies. We need to tailor or change what we're doing because of what's happening. So they're talking about making adaptations. And specifically, they're talking about making adaptations to the how, because they're talking about the strategies that support staff and facilitators to implement the program. So staff and facilitators implementing the program is the what, but the strategies we're using to support them has to do with the how. So this is really about saying we need to make some adaptations to the how. So I'm going to go to our third example and say, where the third person says, I know all these ideas are important, but let's focus on our goal, preventing teen pregnancy. What is this person talking about? Fabulous. And if anyone's having problems annotating, you can definitely put your stuff in the chat box, and you can do it like just type it. Or if you want it to be anonymous, it looks like Taya is adding stamps for people. So you can send just to Taya if you would like it to be anonymous. This one is fabulous. So everyone said outcomes. So this person is talking about the outcomes. We're talking about sustaining those outcomes. Okay, what about the fourth person who says, all those come later? We need to talk about funding. If we don't have money, we don't have a program. So they're talking about funding here. What is that? All right, so here we have in a few different places, but the first place I would put this is factors. So funding is a factor that affects our ability to actually implement. Because in fact, all these factors, see how there's arrows that go from the factors to each of the three different categories? That's because we can have factors that affect our ability to actually deliver that program, say in communities, in schools, and organizations. We can have factors that affect our ability to support people to deliver that program. And there's factors that can affect our ability to collect data and then analyze data on outcomes. And so funding is a factor that can affect all of those different components. Number 5, so we have the fifth person says, we have a huge fidelity issue where staff aren't even implementing the program properly. We should start there. So if there's a lack of fidelity to the program, where do we think that lands? And so remember, the what is the program that is being implemented, right? If it's in communities and organizations and schools through coalitions, the what is the program you're implementing? And the how is how you're supporting people to actually implement that program. So if staff aren't implementing the program well, it's typically a sign that we're having a fidelity issue within the what. Right? So it means that we're having staff who aren't necessarily having fidelity to the original program that you're trying to implement. And so we have a fidelity issue related to this what. And so that's one of the things that sometimes we see when people start planning for sustainability. Our very last component, imagine someone says, what about starting with the things that we know matter? Like having strong partnerships. Is partnerships an adaptation? Is it the program? Is it the supports to implement the program? Is it an outcome or is it a factor? Awesome. So we're seeing things in a few different places. So typically we would think of partnerships as a factor that can in fact affect a lot of different components, particularly the how. And so we see a lot of people putting it up here in factors and in the how. So typically we think of partnerships and having strong partners as a factor that affects sustainability. So one of the first most foundational things in planning for sustainability is starting by having conversations with your teams about when we're talking about sustainability, what are we talking about sustaining? Are we talking about funding and these different factors? Are we talking about organizational capacity, which we'll talk about a little bit later? And I noticed was a comment in the chat box. Are we talking about sustaining the actual delivery of this program, say in the community? Are we talking about supporting people, the outcomes? And are we talking about those adaptations? And so one thing that we have found super helpful is literally bringing this image to meetings when people start talking about different aspects of sustainability and starting to make notes like, ooh, what aspect are they talking about? And have we covered all the aspects that we really need to in order to plan for sustainability? So with that, we are going to jump from talking about what is sustainability to thinking a little bit about roles in the implementation system. So Sophie, I hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. So just to note that for some reason, my neighbors decided to start doing some construction at 3:30 p.m. So if you hear some noise in the background, I'm trying to see if it can be minimized, but hopefully you all can hear what I'm saying. And I hope I'm not distracted. So when we're thinking about roles in the implementation system, it really helps to think about in sustainability, who's taking on what role and why does that role matter? And in order to do this, it really helps to use a framework that describes different roles in the implementation system. So we're thinking about implementation in general, and also which of those roles actually factor into sustainability and are important to sustainability. So this framework is called the Interactive Systems Framework. We also call it the ISF because we love acronyms. And so you'll see it on the screen right now. And so I'm going to go through the different components of the ISF in order to really help you understand the different roles in an implementation system. So the ISF is essentially what it does. It describes what we call the implementation system. So this is the core set of roles that are involved in implementation. So each of these roles you'll see in the figure on the screen that each of the roles is called a system. That's because within the implementation system, there are subsystems. It's conceptualized as subsystems of the overall implementation system. I'm just flagging this because sometimes it can be a bit confusing. Essentially, these subsystems describe the different kinds of roles that can take place in the implementation system. And so when we are thinking about who is doing implementation, we usually think about the people who are delivering an intervention or a program. And so these are the people who reside in the behavior change system. So that is the box on the right-hand side, the behavior change system. And so this might be, for example, a dedicated person. It could be an implementation team within an organization or community. They're the people who are delivering that program or intervention to a set of recipients. So the people who are expected to receive this intervention or program, and those people are usually expected to change their behavior in some sort of way. And so in many cases, the recipients are the direct beneficiaries of the intervention. So that means that when their behavior changes, it actually benefits them and directly, and the outcomes are actually, it pertains to them directly. So for example, if an intervention recipient is an adolescent who is part of a training, then you are trying to change their behavior, and their behavior change actually impacts them directly. Sometimes we also have intervention beneficiaries. That means that these are the people who benefit when the intervention recipient changes their behavior. So here's another example. Imagine you are delivering a program to social workers. Social workers have to change their behavior in some sort of way, but usually their change in behavior actually benefits their client. And so you might have a series of dependencies here, depending on what the nature of the recipient is and the kinds of changes that have to be made. So the thing that people in the behavior change system are implementing is usually developed by the synthesis and translation system. So the synthesis and translation system, this is the left-hand box, and Julia is kind of like hovering over it with her cursor. So these are the people who are looking at the research and who are synthesizing research into products that can actually be implemented. So for example, a program or a guideline. So if you're a program developer, you usually sit in the synthesis and translation system. And their work is informed by primary researchers, which is why you see the primary researchers on that side. So if you think about people who are doing all this research on the evidence related to programs, the people in the synthesis and translation system take all of that primary research, they synthesize that, and they develop a program or a guideline or some sort of product that's ready for uptake. And so they might be disseminating their products for uptake just to facilitate some sort of spread of that program, or they might actually work directly with the behavior change system to implement the product of their work. So that's why you see arrows between the synthesis and translation system and the behavior change system. But you'll notice there's another really important system, and that's between the synthesis and translation system and the behavior change system. And this is the support system, which is sometimes, unfortunately, was overlooked. So the support system supports the delivery of a program by working with the behavior change system. And usually the support system does things like provide tools, training, technical assistance, quality assurance. And I think many of you are familiar with, for example, the role that RTI plays, and that's a support role. So the support system might also work with the synthesis and translation system as well in different ways. So to make the system work, people need to have different kinds of capacities. So you'll see that the box at the top, it says content specific capacity. That means that people need to know, for example, about the APP programs and the content of that. But they also need to know about implementation capacity. They have to know how to implement. So you need different kinds of capacities in order to make the system work. So people need to know the content of what they're implementing, but they also need to know how to implement. And here's another note, that there might be people who are involved in the system that can either be kind of hovering around the system, so they're not necessarily core to implementation, but they're involved because their work impacts the system. So think about, for example, funders. Funders impact the system because they fund the system, but they might not be part of the actual implementation process. But they can also be part of the process in different ways. So we've seen, for example, that sometimes funders can be part of the support system. And so they might actually be, even though they have this funding role, they can actually be part of this implementation system. So I've articulated a few roles, and this is not an exhaustive list of roles, but these are the typical ones we see. That's in that dotted kind of box over here, because these people can be inside the system or outside the system. But it's important to understand their role in the overarching system and where they fit in. So when you're thinking about the ISF, it really helps to think about your role. So what is your role in this whole system, and how do you impact implementation based on the role that you occupy? And what about the people you work with? What are their roles, and how do you all interact with one another? Thinking about roles and thinking about the interactions with roles is incredibly important for implementation, but also for sustainability. So as you're implementing, you could be adopting certain roles, but remember that roles change over time and across implementation phases. So in this slide, we've outlined, some of you might be familiar with this framework called EPIS. It's the exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment model. It really just describes phases of implementation. And so in the first phase, you might be exploring what you're going to implement. And so there might be certain roles that are very prominent and that need to be adopted in the exploration phase. So for example, you need to gain support and funding. So funders could play a huge role here. You have to understand needs and gaps. So there might be a bigger role for people who have evaluative capacities. There are leaders who are trying to get buy-in. There are people who are building teams in the behavior change system. So a lot of this stuff is starting to kind of materialize and happen, and it's being explored. In the preparation stage, Now we start seeing a more prominent role for the support system, because the support system has to do things like train people who are in the behavior change system. And we also see that the behavior change system has a huge role because they're selecting strategies and getting ready to implement. When you reach implementation, then there could be, this is the starring role for the support system and the behavior change system. This is where a lot of their work falls, right? And so the support system is supporting the behavior change system to do their implementation work. And then you might have other players like evaluators who are actually doing the evaluation of implementation along the way. And then comes sustainment. And so here you have a program that has demonstrated some sort of effectiveness and you want to sustain it. And so what roles are needed in order to be able to sustain something? There might be a bigger role, for example, for funders and policymakers here, because you need resources, you need the political will to sustain something. Perhaps here you want to spread and scale. So you're also going to need resources for that. You also have to think about what the support role needs to do differently in order to sustain that program. Also, what does the behavior change system need to do, and how are you going to sustain roles in that system? So you do really have to think about what are the different factors and roles related to sustaining a program based on what people need to do and what kind of role they adopt. So in the next slide, we've actually articulated a few special considerations related to roles for sustainability. So when you're thinking about what people have to do and the kinds of roles that need to be occupied, you need to have dedicated and entrenched support roles in the system. So these are people who provide ongoing support, because we know there's a lot of change in the system, there's a lot of turnover, and how do you actually embed support within the system to capture new staff, to capture older staff, to capture people who are newly adopting a program. So you want to be able to ensure those support roles are entrenched in the system. It really helps to have dedicated full-time employees for delivery roles in the behavior change system. You have to think about continuous monitoring and evaluation. So you've evaluated implementation, but what happens over the long term? What is going to be evaluated and who's going to do that evaluation? And you have to think about the partnerships between implementers, policymakers, funders, and researchers. And so how is this whole system and sustainment of the program going to be resourced? How's the political will going to be, increased? What kind of policy changes are required in order to be able to sustain something? So thinking about all those factors related to sustainability, who's involved in those factors and how are they involved over the long term? So with that being said, we are going to launch into our third activity where we're going to talk about roles in the implementation system. And here you will have to turn to your workbook. And so if you've not yet downloaded the workbook, Ty, I don't know if you are able to include the link in the chat just for people who have not found the workbook yet. And I'm also going to, there we go, there's a link to the workbook. I'm also going to include the scenario in the chat because this is a scenario that requires you to read through what the scenario is, and then we're going to do a little bit of an annotation activity. So here we go. So I've also put the scenario in the chat. So you can turn to page 12 in your workbook, or you can read the scenario in the chat. Essentially, in this scenario, there's a charter school which has been given funding by the state for pregnancy and STI prevention. They're implementing a program for young people ages 13 to 19 in partnership with other organizations, specifically a Baptist church and the local YMCA. The facilitators are employees of the charter school. There's also a local university evaluator completing the evaluation for the funder. I don't know if you can hear the drilling right now, but right now I can hear drilling. Facilitators have access to monthly webinars and an annual conference to build their skills and provide supports. I'm going to give you a minute. There's a lot of text, so just give you a minute just to kind of absorb that, because we're going to ask about who occupies what role in the next activity. So just give you a few seconds to read through this. Okay. So the first question, sorry, Lisa, the drilling sound, it does sound like a growling dog. So imagine having to present with the sound of a growling dog in your ear. That's what it feels like right now. So, okay, with that being said, okay, if everyone has gotten a chance to read the scenario themselves and let that absorb, the first question is, you can take out your handy annotation tool now that you know how to use it. Think about the facilitator role. Where in this implementation system does the facilitator reside? And again, if you're having difficulty annotating, you could always type out your answer in the chat box. So we're seeing a lot of people say the behavior change system. We have few support systems, a synthesis and translation system. We see the facilitator role primarily being in the behavior change system, because the facilitator is part of the delivery of the program. And so that person or the set of facilitators are people who are delivering the program to the intervention recipients. In some cases, because not everybody has like really discrete roles all the time, sometimes somebody who's in the implementation team sometimes provides a support role. So it's true that you could be part of both the support system and the behavior change system. But in this example, we see their role primarily being in the behavior change system. Okay, let's clear this off. So the next question, think about the State Department. Where are they in this implementation system? What is their role? Through the support system. So primarily, and I see a few people who are annotating the funders, yes. So we see them outside of they're in that kind of dash box. We see the support system. So yes, they're primarily funders because they are, the charter school has been given funding by the state for this specific program, but the funders can also have a different role. So a lot of people are saying the support role. And so this is likely because the funders also involved in different ways. If you keep reading through the scenario, the funders involved not just in the funding, but in different ways throughout implementation. So they are involved in the implementation system, not just as a funder, but because, as you've read later, they are also, involved in the evaluation piece. So let's clear this off. Okay, what about young people aged 13 to 19? What is their role in this whole system? Okay, so we see primarily intervention recipients and intervention beneficiaries. This is a case where they are both the recipient and the beneficiary because they are receiving the intervention and they directly benefit. The outcomes are related to their own behavior change. And so, yes, that's very true of the young people aged 13 to 19.
Sophia, can I just jump in and give one example that people might be familiar with where those are different? Mm-hmm. Say you're implementing a parenting program where the goal is to improve children's outcomes. The parents might be the intervention recipients and the beneficiaries in that case might be the children, right? So just showing that like sometimes it's the same and sometimes it's different depending on the kind of program that you have.
Okay, so we just have two more. What about the group that's coordinating the webinars and the conference? Where do they fall in the system? Exactly, we're seeing a ton of support system. And that's primarily what they're doing. So what they're trying to do is ensure that people in the behavior change system have the right capacities to be able to implement. And so that's the whole point of having the webinars and the annual conference, is to ensure that they have the capacity. And so therefore they reside in the support system. Now, what about let's clear this off. Finally, what about the evaluators? Where do they fall in the system? So, okay, so we see people. So the evaluators are evaluating the program, which means that, and they're from a local university, so they're likely academics and researchers. So it's true that the evaluators in this case could be researchers as well. And so those things are true. So usually we try to differentiate between the people who are doing the primary research versus the evaluation of a program. The primary research is usually the evidence we use to develop a program. And then the people who are evaluating are actually part of the system in a different way because they're usually working alongside the implementers or working with the behavior change system in some way to be able to evaluate that program. So it's true that the evaluators would be in that little dotted box rather than on the primary research side. Any questions here? I'm sorry about the drilling again. It sounds like a growling dog. Hopefully we got through this together. Any questions here about the interactive systems framework?
While people are pondering questions, I can add I can add a note, and I want a question for people as well. One is we have 15 minutes for Q&A. So as we're going through this, if anyone has questions as we're going through, you can type them in the chat box and we will make note of them and we can loop back to our Q&A as well because we have lots of time for that. Also, while we're still on this screen, it would be very, very helpful for us and very interesting to know where you fall in the interactive systems framework. So can you take out your annotation one more time and put the places where your role lands? And it could land in more than one place. And so where are you in the implementation system? Fabulous. So lots of support system people, which is not surprising because I think a lot of you are supporting people who are in the behavior change system. And a lot of you are the behavior change system. It looks like there's some synthesis and translation and some primary researchers, a few funders, a few, let's say, implementation researchers and evaluators, but predominantly in the support and behavior change systems. Fabulous. All right, so with that, we are going to jump to our third part of our presentation for today, which is about understanding and prioritizing sustainability levers for change. So we are going to get deep into things like partnering and trust when we talk on Thursday. Today is kind of a bit of an overview to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into that. But I think to set the stage really nicely for that, it's helpful to understand what are some of those factors that affect sustainability that can be used as levers for change. The first thing I'm going to share is a piece of what I think is really, really, really good research news. And that is, did you know there is research that shows that planning for sustainability increases the likelihood you are going to sustain your intervention or your program? So literally, if you go back to your teams and say, let's sit down and develop a sustainability plan, that increases the likelihood that is actually going to happen, which I think is phenomenally great news. If you go to do that, a lot of people say, okay, so literally what would I do if I brought this to my team? We would say, step one, figure out what is it that you're talking about sustaining. You can take that image and say, what is it you're talking about when you talk about sustainability? Step two, start thinking about who are the key players in your implementation system using, for example, that interactive systems framework, and you can map that out and say, hey, who are these key players? Number three is to use an assessment tool to understand what levers for change you can use. So the one that seems the most relevant for your work is called the Program Sustainability Assessment Tool. It's a freely available tool. We are not directly linked to anyone using this. It's just online. It's one of the 4 kind of tools that we recommend. and have seen lots and lots of people successfully use. It's available at sustaintool.org, and that's also linked out in your workbook. And this tool literally allows you to do an assessment of these different levers or factors for change so that you can then identify what are your strengths and what are potentially some opportunities that you need to be working on or can work on. And it talks about these 8 different components that affect sustainability. So I'm going to quickly go through these 8 components, and you can read lots more about them on their website, and they have lots of tools available there. But I'm going to quickly go through and share a little bit about how partnerships, environmental support, funding stability, communications, organizational capacity, strategic planning, program evaluation, and program adaptation can help in planning for sustainability. Also, FYI, we will have one more annotation activity where we have 3 different scenarios, and we'll map them to these, just so you have that in the back of your minds as I go through the different concepts. So number 1, did you know that if you have strong partnerships with a diversity of people and organizations, this sets you up to have a better likelihood that you are actually going to sustain what it is that you are doing. Partnerships increase the chance you can sustain what it is that you're doing. So we are going to talk lots about partnerships on Thursday. Number 2, when local, state, and federal policies or political climate align with what you are doing, so in this case, adolescent pregnancy prevention, then it is easier to sustain your intervention. And based on reading comments that people had from the questions that we asked, it sounds like some of you are in positions where this local, state policies really are supporting what you're doing, and some people are in positions where that is not the case. These things don't need to be true to sustain, but they make it easier to sustain and easier to leverage kind of those state, local, state, and federal policies. Number 3, funding stability increases the likelihood of sustainability. So having money, particularly from multiple sources, makes it easier to sustain long-term. But one thing I really like to share is that sustainability is not, or funding is not sufficient for sustainability. Lots of people believe and assume that if you get money, you will be able to sustain what it is that you're doing. And that is in fact not necessarily true. Funding alone does not guarantee sustainability. And that's why it's so important to look at the 7 other levers and not just funding when you're planning for sustainability. And Sobi and I have both seen instances where people had lots of funding and weren't able to sustain, and no funding and have been able to sustain. And so funding makes it easier, but it is not the only factor. Next, we have communications. When you have effective communication internally within your team or organization or the organizations you're working with, and external communication about the program and mission that help you gain visibility, this increases the likelihood of sustainability. So having that really good internal and external communication actually increases the chances that you're going to be able to sustain what it is that you're doing. Earlier, someone mentioned in the chat box, they were like, I'm not so worried about sustaining the program. I want to sustain organizational capacity. And that is fabulous because organizational capacity is also essential for sustaining programs. Organizational capacity is having that knowledge and skills and the climate and resources and leadership buy-in to actually implement things, specifically a program or potentially more generally. And that makes it easier to sustain any program that you are implementing. Strategic planning. So when you can put your program on strategic plans, it better sets you up for sustainability. And this works really beautifully when you have partnerships with different groups or organizations or communities and can get your work on other people's strategic plans, because it really can leverage those pieces coming together. Next, sometimes surprisingly, people discover that program evaluation can actually increase sustainability. If you have good tracking data and good outcomes, you can present a more powerful argument for why you should be sustained. Several years ago, I was working with a state or working with a group, a community that was implementing a program statewide. And in each local area, they had amazing program evaluation data that they were able to use to show up to organizations like the United Way and convince them to fund their program that had originally been funded by the state, because they had such powerful program evaluation data that was in fact effectively communicated and created a lot of visibility for them. As we've talked about throughout today, adaptations are the reality of implementing any program. And when teams recognize the need to make adaptations and they proactively plan for those adaptations, they're more likely to sustain things, because otherwise adaptations get made without being planned, and that's when things often don't go as well. So those are the 8 components that you can learn about more from the program sustainability assessment tool. And then ideally what you want to figure out is, where do we land on each of these 8 components? And which ones can we use as levers for change? Essentially, which one of these can we leverage to get the biggest bang for our buck, where doing a little bit of work here can actually result in a large impact for us? Because some of these, you're not going to have great things across the board on all of them, but sometimes a few changes can really enhance how you sustain your work. Partnerships is a massive part of this, and that is why we are going to focus so much on partnerships on Thursday. But before we get to that and wrap up and go to our Q&A, we have one last activity where we're going to talk about these sustainability levers for change. If you go to your workbook on page 15 and 16, we have 3 different scenarios. And I am going to read them out. Actually, Sylvia, can you copy them into the chat box as well? Maybe scenario 1 first. That was a super fabulous idea. So Sylvia is going to copy that in to the chat box. And so essentially, we're going to go through these 3 scenarios. And what we want you to do is, now you're going to have to switch back and forth between different stamps. Put a check mark stamp if something is a facilitator, and put an X stamp if this might be a barrier to sustainability. So if you think this is kind of an asset people have, put a check mark. And if it's a barrier, we're going to put an X. But first, we'll read the whole scenario. Imagine you are implementing a community-based pregnancy prevention program. You, number 1, have great evaluation data. Number 2, you have a strong partnership with the Boys and Girls Club of America. Number 3, you have aligned the program with a state-level initiative. Number 4, there's major issues with staff turnover. And number 5, right now you don't have any funding for sustainability. So perfect, people are already check marking away. So one you can think about, we're not going to clear it in between the scenario, so you can check the whole scenario. So 1, rate of value. So I'll silently let you add your 5. You should be adding 5 check marks to the screen. Fabulous. So it looks like number one, great program evaluation data. Everyone's saying check marks and even some hearts down here for program evaluation. So you've mapped that one to the right place. Number two, there's a strong partnership with Boys and Girls Club of America. And I see all of these check marks and hearts for partnership. So this is a great example of a partnership. You have aligned the program with a state level initiative. So here we have that environmental supports, right? So it's aligned with the state level initiative. And I'm going to take a guess that this is potentially where some people also added communications. So technically none of these directly talked about whether there was strong internal or external communication, but I'm going to take a leap and assume that people are saying, hey, hopefully when you aligned this, you also communicated that effectively. But then we notice a lot of X's related to funding stability and this organizational capacity because they're having staff turnover problems. So great assessment of what is happening here in scenario one. Now for scenario two, Sylvia, can you copy that in? Perfect. So you are implementing a school-based pregnancy prevention program. You, one, have funding stability. Two, have a new principal at the school who doesn't really get it. Three, there are poor internal relationships, particularly between the teachers and administrators. Four, this program is being implemented once, but teachers made a lot of changes. And five, the evaluators collected data, but you have never seen it. I'll give you a moment. Wonderful. So I'm seeing lots of check marks for funding stability because yes, in this case, this is an example where they have funding stability. But there's a new principal at the school who doesn't totally get it. And that tells me there's potentially an organizational capacity issue. If leadership at the school, like the principal, isn't totally on board with what is happening. There are poor internal relationships, particularly between the teachers. And so that can be an organizational capacity. And also it sounds like there's some communication issues within the school. It's being implemented once, but people made changes. Essentially, they made adaptations that were not those planned adaptations, but were kind of reactive adaptations that maybe weren't ideal. And you have an evaluator that's collected data, but you've never seen it. And so I actually see a mix kind of, and I would almost put maybe a question mark here where it's like, well, maybe it's good, but maybe it's bad, because if we have data, that could be good. But if you've never seen it, then it's not really something you can leverage at the moment. And so in this example, we really wanted to highlight, oh, perfect. So Valerie, beautiful summary. We wanted to highlight that lots of people, when they think about sustainability, think funding is the only thing you need. And we wanted to highlight that funding is good in this situation. But if these other pieces like environmental support, org capacity, partnerships, evaluation are not great, you're not going to get there. So funding is good, but it's not the only thing to have. Our very final example, so our last activity, last example of the day is scenario number 3. So in this scenario, you are using a coalition model to support the implementation of several evidence-based programs in pregnancy prevention. You have a great relationship with the 2 high schools and 3 middle schools and the Department of Social Services, right? Because it's a coalition model. You're funded by the state and have support from a prevention support center. Funding will end in 1 year and you don't have continued funding. 2 key members of the coalition have stepped down, and now the new leads don't understand prevention as much as the previous people did. And the person responsible for communicating key messages also left. And she was great at getting the message out through reports, infographics, Twitter, Facebook. And so you're kind of trying to figure out how you're going to get a plan in place for that. So I see annotations have started, so I will let you keep going. Fabulous. So really, really like where this is going. So starting, it sounds like you have good relationships, and I'm seeing these checks and hearts for partnerships. So it sounds like partnerships is really key. And you're funded by the state and have support from the prevention center. So we're seeing kind of some environmental support, these partnerships pieces. And I like how people have identified that funding has both a check, you currently have funding, and an X because it's ending in a year. So it's kind of like a bit of both going on right there. There's these members of the coalition that have stepped down. And so it sounds like you have some organizational capacity issues related to who's on that team. And you definitely potentially have some communication stuff. And in fact, it sounds like it once was good. So you have some check marks, but maybe have some issues to deal with as you think about what that is really going to look like. And so I can also see, we didn't go into strategic planning pieces in detail, but it sounds like this is actually very nicely aligned with your partnerships and your environmental support with that strategic planning. It sounds kind of like this upper section is doing quite well, but some other challenges. And so the reason we wanted to go through these scenarios is to show you that everyone's situation in planning for sustainability can look really different. And so don't just assume that you automatically have the same situation as another group. Understanding what's really happening and what levers you can use is so powerful in helping you think about sustainability and how you can kind of move things forward. We are going to open it up for all of your deck marks. We're going to open it up for questions, but first I just wanted to have a little wrap up, stay with us, because I know some people stay on longer to questions. So one, if you want to connect with us, we're super active mostly on Twitter. And that's probably the best way to follow us and learn more about how we're thinking about implementation. Huge thank you for so much participation, lots of check marks, annotation, learning how to use annotate. I can tell for many of you, that was awesome. We are going to do lots more activities like that on Thursday as we get into partnerships and trust building. And so with that, I am going to jump back to questions. Actually, maybe I'll stop screen sharing so we can all see each other. And you are welcome to come off of mute and share thoughts, questions, reflections, or put them in the chat box. Oh, Taya, you are on mute.
Sorry about that. I see one question from Carla Angus. We will have the video. It'll post to the website. You need to give us some time, but it will be available for access. Yes.
Before Thursday?
I'm sorry. I thought she said before, not before Thursday. Sorry, not before Thursday. We can share slides maybe to get you caught up if that's helpful, Carla.
And I would say
I was getting ready to be super impressed. I was like, oh my God, it's gonna be ready by Thursday.
Somehow my brain didn't process this.
I would take the question anyway. I appreciate it. And the website is the same one where we downloaded the booklet from, correct?
Actually, you mean where will the video be? Is that your question?
Yes.
It'll be actually on the Exchange.
Okay.
In our resource section. Mm-hmm.
And we can put the slides on the place that you downloaded the booklet as well. So you can have the booklet and the slides so that even if you missed the first part, and if you missed the first part, you can still jump into the content for Thursday. Yeah, you'll be fine. And Holly mentioned she won't be available on Thursday, but it will be recorded as well.
Yep.
I know a burning question that people had is, did the drilling stop? And the answer is no, but sorry, yes, but the hammering has started. So yeah.
I have a question here about whether they're able to share these images with their teams and the workbook with their teams. 100%, yes. You can go and share this workbook with your team. You can sit down, use those images. Absolutely not a problem. And also,
what if we are doing professional development training for other youth organizations outside of our own team that are involved in this grant?
Can we get back to you on that specific question, Judith, and we'll just like confirm what kind of like, we'll link to Taya and send an email to you about that, about like what you can use and stuff.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I take that as such a wonderful job that you guys did, both you, Sylvia, as well as Dr. Moore. Thank you so much for today's training. You've laid a great foundation for our day 2 training, which is on Thursday. And we will be exploring partnerships in detail and doing a breakout and a lot of other engaging activities. So thank you to everyone for joining. Please take care, and we look forward to seeing you back here on Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.